Okay, I'm going to start as Muslims do in the name of Allah, in the name of God. In Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah amma ba'd. I greet you with the warmest Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Which basically means may the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. Thank you very much for that very warm introduction. I was quite fascinated by his X-Men belt, by the way. That was quite cool. But that's another topic. Today's topic is a very important topic. The reason it's a very important topic because it addresses very fundamental questions. Questions pertaining to yourself, who you are, your existence, your purpose, if you have one. And questions relating to mankind, humanity, life and the whole universe. This is why it's an important topic. Now sometimes in our society, we don't even think these questions are important anymore. Why? The reason we don't think these questions are important anymore because we suspend this thinking. Why do we suspend the thinking? Because we have the iPhone now. We don't need to think anymore. I have all the games I could play with. I have the iPod that I could listen to all the various MP3s. Or I have my laptop. Or the ridiculous thing called an iPad, which is between a laptop and an iPhone. The nature of consumerism, which is basically saying you have too many needs. And I know you have extra needs and you need something called the iPad and here we've got it for you. The unjust nature of the consumer society, because what does consumerism do? It makes you think that you have needs that you think you need but you didn't really need in the first place and provide you products for it in order for the capitalist society to increase. But that's another discussion. So the point is, we suspend this critical thinking. We suspend trying to answer the very questions that's going to give us some form of tranquility. Now, why am I using this word tranquility? I'm using this word tranquility is because a lot of us, even people in this very room, we suffer from a personal disease, I call it a disease, called self-annihilationism in psychology. To self-annihilate is to basically say, I don't know who I am, or I think I know who I am, and I don't like who I am. So what I do is I self-annihilate, I self-destruct by doing what? Drugs, alcohol, creating immersive environments, such as the Xbox, or computer games. I'm not saying these things are wrong or bad, I'm not saying there's something intrinsically evil with these things, but we have to understand that especially in Western society, and yes, I know it's a very cliched way of defining things, Western society, but I'm doing it with a small W, not a big W, okay? So in Western society, we immerse ourselves in these things, like alcohol, drugs, to self-annihilate, because we don't even know who we are. And this is a fundamental question. Who are we? You may think, how does this relate to the good delusion? Well, it does, and we're going to get there. It's a little bit of a journey, this talk. And this is why I want you to have a conversation with me today, because conversations are important. I'm not a preacher, I'm not a scholar, he called me a sheikh, I'm not a sheikh, I'm more like a milk sheikh than a sheikh, okay? So I'm just a normal human being that likes to engage. I really want to have an intimate discussion with you guys, so we could connect with each other as human beings. And I just want to give you some of my thoughts. And some of these thoughts may be right, they may be wrong, they may be half right and half wrong, but I want to have that discussion because I think these are the questions we must be asking ourselves. So, we don't know who we are, or we don't like who we are, we think we know who we are. Now this relates to a very interesting statement from a famous writer, an American writer, and he said that being born, your own very birth, being born is like being kidnapped and then sold into slavery. And I think this is true because I don't think there's any true sense of freedom. We may think we're free, we must have liberty, equality, fraternity, as the French fundamentally continue to go on about, ironically, but they're banning a woman's freedom to cover her face. Another discussion, of course. But the point is, we think we're free, but we're not free, because in reality, we just have slavery. I know this is a big word here, but let me tell you something. We didn't choose our own birth. You didn't choose your height. You didn't choose your eye color. You didn't even choose your gender. You know what? You didn't choose your parents. You didn't even choose your siblings. You didn't even choose your socio-economic status. You had no choice. None at all. None at all. This is similar to the concept of the modern philosophers, the existentialists like Heidegger and Kierkegaard, they raised amazing points. And they said there's a concept called thrownness. The human being is just thrown into a reality. He's thrown into a particular existence. And he has no choice in him being thrown into this existence. He has no choice that he was going to be a Pakistani. He had no choice that he's going to be a Scotsman. He had no choice that he was going to be male or female. And the existentialists, they talked in depth about how we must have a sense of responsibility and accountability in order to really deal with our lives in a productive way. It is what it is. Let's move forward. So from this perspective, you're not really free because you didn't choose any of these things. So it comes to the question then, who are we then? How are we? What are we? Why are we? Whose are we? Because these are the important questions. So when we think, right, am I therefore just a product of my socio-economic circumstance? Am I a product of my parents? Am I a product of Scottish society? Am I a product of liberalism? Am I a product of capitalism? Am I just a reaction to these things? These are important questions. Am I what I am just because of my social, political, economic, biological environment? If that's the case, people, then you're no different from a robot. Just type in the social biological code and you just act in accordance. So in a way, you're meaningless. In a way, you're just input and output. But is that who we are? Is that who we really are? Just a reaction to social biological context, a very kind of blind, cold determinism? Is that who we are? I think intuitively, and if we look deep inside, we know we're not these things. Or we would like to transcend these things. And that's the search of freedom. Because we're always in a state of reference and slavery from this perspective. Now, from the Islamic discourse perspective, we say that you choose your slavery. Because you're either a slave to your ego, to your own self, and that's how you define yourself. You're a slave to your social biological circumstances, or we say you're a slave to God, slave to Allah. And by enslaving yourself, being a servant to the divine, it frees you from the ephemeral nature of the world, such as your ego and social biological conditioning. So conceptually, and this is a brave point I'm making here, being a Muslim, or being someone who submits to the divine, is actually the freest person on this planet. Say that to Bush when he said enduring freedom. Honestly, conceptually that's the case. Because there is no true absolute freedom. We just have free will and free choice to choose our slavery. You're going to be a slave to yourself. You're going to be a slave to society, to the system, to whatever the case may be, social biological conditioning. Or are you going to be a slave to the divine, which frees you from these things? Now, how does this relate to the God delusion? Well, it does. Because once we get to know who we are now, by understanding why we are, then we'll know whose we are. And I'm going to leave this open so we can conclude at the end. So, the God delusion. Many neo-atheists, I call them fundamentalist atheists, like Richard Dawkins, for instance, when he was in a documentary on Channel 4, he would speak to little 12-year-old girls about evolution and act like an amazing atheist high priest and say, why don't you believe in evolution? Believe in me. Yeah, he had this kind of, almost, in my humble opinion, an arrogant intellectual stance. And it's quite a shame that he doesn't really engage with people like us on a normal level to have an intellectual frank discourse. He just debates what people would define as a mad mullah, for example, just to create that kind of antithesis, that extreme. Well, here's a really educated guy and a really backward religious guy. Look, this is why he's so great. And it's a shame that the media does this a lot, and it's a shame that we don't have more frank discussions about these topics. Anyway, so we have the likes of Richard Dawkins that calls God a delusion, calls God a figment of humanity's imagination. It's an untruth, it's baseless. We also have the late Christopher Hitchens, who recently died of throat cancer. He was not only an atheist, he called himself an anti-theist. And I remember, I think it was on CNN or Fox News, he would basically say that even if God did exist, I would reject him. Because you'd be like living under a dictatorship, like North Korea. This was a kind of attitude from these fundamentalist atheists in my humble view. And why am I being so almost pugnacious about this, calling them fundamentalists, etc.? Because I really believe that. If you read the works like the God Delusion, and you read God is Not Great, and you read A Letter to a Christian Nation from Sam Harris, or you read his recent book on morality, The Moral Landscape, you would see so many outdated cliches, regurgitated medieval arguments against the existence of God. Now you think this is hot claims. Maybe they are, but hopefully I'll be able to engage with a dialogue with you guys to expose some of these ideas to show that, look, actually, not only is the existence of God, and I'm going to further relate to Islam as a worldview, a reality and based on good reasons, but also that the arguments trying to go against this are actually outdated cliches, straw men, and ancient arguments from this perspective. So, what I'm going to try and do is present a positive case for religion, a positive case for God, a positive case for Islam, deal with some contentions, and then we'll have a Q&A. I think this is the best way of doing that, because just going through all the literature and saying, he said this, we say that, that's not a very productive way of dealing with it. It's very defensive. Let's assert a positive case. Let's construct a positive case for the existence of God with premises and a substructure to an argument, deal with contentions, the main contentions from these neo-atheists, and then we'll have a Q&A. Now, let's go to a very key argument for the existence of God. I call this the argument from the beginning of the universe. I also like to call this a Quranic argument because the premises of the argument is actually in the Qur'an itself. I'll discuss this a bit later. So the first argument is the argument from the beginning of the universe. Now, the British philosopher Derek Parfit, he made an amazing point. He said, essentially we should be questioning, why is there something rather than nothing? This is the big question in analytical philosophy. Why is there something rather than nothing? The German polymath Leibniz, he said, the first question we should ask and answer is, why is there something rather than nothing? And this is why when we question reality, or we look into the intricacies of the universe, we'll come to a very sound conclusion of why there is something rather than nothing. Now, the typical 1960s Bertrand Russell approach to this question is, well, reality, the universe is a brute fact. It was there and that's it. Namely, it's eternal. They had no beginning, it had no end, it's just a brute fact. But I think if we reflect upon this, we will come to the conclusion that actually the universe can't be eternal, no beginning, no end. It must have had a beginning. And if it had a beginning, it must have had a cause. And let me discuss this. If the universe was eternal, it would imply that there's an infinite history of past events. I repeat, if the universe was eternal, no beginning, no end, it would imply that there is an infinite history to the past, the events of the universe. But I want to question something. Can the concept of the infinite actually exist in the real world? In the physical universe? Can the infinite exist in the real world? Now we know the infinite makes sense in mathematics because you have some axioms and convections that actually make the concept of the infinity a coherent concept. But I'm talking about reality, the real world. Can we imply the infinite into the real world? I would say no. It leads to contradictions and paradoxes. Let me give an example. If I had an infinite number of Omars in this room, whether some of us would like it or not is a different story. But you are cute, mashallah, yeah? But you can tell you make such a beautiful effort, man. So imagine there's an infinite number of Omars in this room. And if I take 5 Omars away, how many Omars do we have left? Infinite, mathematically. But that's absurd, isn't that a paradox? Shouldn't we have 5 less than infinite? Shouldn't we now be able to count how many Omars there are in the room? Let's give you another scenario. Say we had 100 Omars in the room. And at every possible moment, I add another Omar. Omar 101, Almost 102, almost 103, almost 1,000,001. Will I ever reach a number of almas that I could define as infinite? No, because the infinite is never actualized. It's just potential, because you could always have +1, +1, n +1, n +1. So the infinite from this perspective doesn't make sense in the real world. So if the infinite doesn't make sense in the real world, then it doesn't make sense in the universe. It doesn't make sense with regards to the history of past events. Because you can't have an infinite history of past events for the universe, therefore there must have been a beginning. Point number one. Point number two, to show that there was a beginning to the universe. According to modern cosmologists like Alexander Vilenkin, who is one of the greatest theoretical cosmologists on this planet according to some, we have the idea of the Big Bang. Who's heard of the Big Bang? Good. And it's not that thing that happens after too many curries, okay? The Big Bang, which was actually a phrase pronounced by one of the scientists of the time to actually belittle the idea of the Big Bang. But if you look at the hot standard model, essentially what cosmologists are saying, that there was a beginning. There was a beginning in time. There is a point where t time is equal to 0. Or there is a point that the laws of nature break down and we can't explain anything. But generally, according to theoretical physicists, we have a certain beginning. Now there are alternative views of the Big Bang, like the fluctuation models, the quantum fluctuation models, the oscillating models, that say you don't need a beginning in time. But that's a different discussion, and we could argue that there are principles in these models that necessitate a beginning in time. But I don't want to get too technical because this is Glasgow. I'm only kidding, yeah? Yeah? So, the point I'm trying to say is there is a beginning in time. For example, Alexander Vilenkin, he states, and I think he said this in 2006, that we can't run away now. We can't run away from the beginning of the universe. The beginninglessness of the universe doesn't make sense anymore. So, what can we conclude here? We can conclude that the universe began to exist. So how can we understand the reality of the universe with regards to its beginning? Well, there are some possible conclusions. 3 options. And the Qur'an mentions these 3 options. Number 1, it came from nothing. Who's Pakistani here? Many of you. Have you heard of the saying, muchne to kuchne? If you have no moustache, you have nothing. Kuchne, yeah? Similar to this. Can the universe come from kuchne? Nothing. Can the universe itself come from nothing? That's the first option. Well, philosophically, out of nothing, what comes? Nothing. If I went down into my pocket, I had nothing in my pocket, and I gave you something, what would it be? Nothing, because from nothing, nothing comes. If you have a waterfall that has no water, and I get a cup, and I do this, what's in the cup? Nothing. So the point is, from nothing, nothing comes. This is why P.J.W. Zwart, in his publication about time, he says, something that we could find inconceivable is that something could arise from nothing. This is an intuitive, metaphysical, empirical fact almost. It's a priori, it's a necessary truth, and it's a posteriori. We could find it in reality. Something doesn't pop into existence out of nothing. For example, if I went like that and an elephant came, that would be impossible. Okay? I'm not the elephant, by the way. I may look like one, but different story. So, let me just pick up my pen. The point is that out of nothing, nothing comes. However, there is a contention amongst the scientific atheist community who say, no, you can have something out of nothing. Because what they say, they refer to quantum physics. I don't claim to be a quantum physicist, by the way, yeah? But let's have a conceptual understanding of what's going on here. They say in the quantum vacuum, you have subatomic particles that randomly appear. Or there are things that are happening within the quantum field that do not correspond to causality. Therefore, something can come from nothing. But it's about linguistics. What do they mean by nothing? We mean the absence of energy and matter. They mean the quantum field. And the quantum field is something. According to the philosopher of science, John Polkinghorne, he says, the quantum vacuum is something. It's a rich structure, it obeys the laws of the universe, and it's a sea of fluctuating energy. So it is actually something. Also, when they claim that things can happen for no reason without any cause, is a certain view interpretation of quantum physics, which is the indeterministic view, a view that's held by people like Stephen Hawking and others, and the majority of the physicists. However, there is another interpretation, which is like the 1950s David Bohm interpretation, like the Copenhagen theory, that basically says, no, things, when they happen in the quantum field, are as a result of causes. So there are two interpretations. You don't have to hold on to one of them. So the contention from the atheist community is actually not a valid contention. It doesn't break down the argument that things can come from nothing. Also, Stephen Hawking, he's a very popular scientist. He wrote the book, The Grand Design. Now, upon reading this book, in the introduction, he says, philosophy is dead. And the irony is, when you read the whole book, it's full of what? It's full of philosophy. That's the irony. I just don't get these people. It's like they make the God in the morning and they eat him in the evening. Yeah? It just doesn't make any sense. So he said philosophy is dead, but yet let's talk about philosophy. Anyway, he says the universe can come from nothing. But again, his definition of nothing is the quantum vacuum is actually something. So we can conclude that the first option is implausible, untenable, irrational. Something cannot come from nothing. Good. So what's the next option? That the universe created itself. Can the universe create itself, people? Can it create itself, bro? Why? You. Why? It didn't exist in the first place. We have a logician in the room. You doing optometry? No. No. Too hard, too much physics, yeah? No. What are you studying? Chemical engineering. That's even worse, man. Chemical engineering. So, can something create itself? Well, first and foremost, this is illogical. It's a paradox, because that would imply that something was in existence and not in existence at the same time. For instance, brother, what's your name? Zishan. Zishan. Can your mother give birth to herself? It'd be very messy, right? It would be impossible. That's the implication here. Can there be self-creation here? Can something exist and not exist at the same time? Impossible. Irrational. Implausible. Untenable, people. Something cannot create itself. However, Stephen Hawking, he says it can. In his book, The Grand Design. And you know why he says that? He says self-creation is possible. And I think he says this on page number 60. Self-creation is possible because of gravity. You're better than Stephen Hawking? You arrogant man. He's one of the biggest brains in the world. You're laughing at him? Oh, so you should. Who cares if they've got degree X, Y, and Z? We're rational human beings. We need to learn to think here. We need to learn to think. Yeah? Can the universe create itself? Well, he says yes, it can because of gravity. The problem here is, what is gravity? Gravity is, what is it? Exactly, you need matter to exist for gravity to exist. It's the force of attraction between two objects in a very crude way. So in a way, he's saying the universe must exist and not exist at the same time for the universe to self-create. Paradox. So self-creation is implausible. Now what about the next option? It was created. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. An undeniable metaphysical principle that we see not only in reality. When you hear a sound, that'll woke you up. When you hear sound, it came from somewhere. It doesn't appear. For example, if you saw a 747 in your back garden overnight, you don't say, oh, things happen. You don't do that. That's totally irrational, mind-boggling, yeah? So it is impossible to claim that the universe just appeared, because whatever begins to exist must have a cause. All we know, guys, is there's a cause. We can't claim it's Allah, God, Buddha, Jesus, whatever the case may be. All we know is that this cause caused the universe. However, upon conceptual analysis, which basically means let's think a little bit deeper about this cause, we could come to some striking conclusions. First and foremost, this cause must be uncaused. Why? Because of the absurdity of the infinite regress of causes. Why am I saying this? Because if you say, what caused the cause that caused the universe? Then what stops us from saying what caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the universe? And then we could continue to say, well, what caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the universe? Now what about that cause that caused the 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 cause? You get my point here? If that is an infinite chain, infinite regress, we'll never have creation in the first place. So the question itself almost denies our existence. So by rational necessity must be uncaused. Now someone may argue, well, why don't you just say that about the universe is uncaused? There's a different question here though. We have good reasons to believe it began. And if it began, therefore it must be caused. So by rational necessity must be uncaused. If it caused the whole universe, it must be intelligent. Why? Because there are laws in the universe. And someone that caused or created or evoked the laws in the universe must be a type of lawgiver. And a lawgiver implies what? An intelligence. So uncaused, intelligent. Who are we defining here slowly? We're defining the divine from the monotheistic perspective. As the Qur'an says in the 112th chapter, قُلْ say, هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. Say, He is God, the uniquely one, the eternal. He begets not, nor was He begotten. There is nothing like unto Him. Which is the third point, He's immaterial. He's not within the universe. He transcends the universe because He created the universe. Because if God was just a material being, then you got the same problem of the question of the infinite regress. Because a material being can't be as a result of a material being, because if God continues forever, then you have an infinite regress, which is absurd. It must transcend the chain. So we've come to a very basic conclusion using reality and reason. And the irony is, atheists say that we're backward people. Atheists say, and I'm not saying all atheists, of course. I don't mean that in any shape or form. I'm just saying it from a popular sense, that many of these neo-atheists like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, they say that we're backward. You shouldn't debate these people. They're stupid. They're crazy creationists. But we have a cogent case for our worldview. People of belief, theists, Christians, Jews, Christians, I said that twice. That's because there's more than one type of Christian maybe, yeah? Catholic, Protestant, whatever the case may be, Muslim. We have a positive case for our worldview that the divine exists. Based on one argument, there's many other arguments. Let's use the second argument. It's one of my favorite arguments. It's about the design of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe to permit our own very existence. Now, Professor Roger Penrose, he raised a very interesting point in one documentary. And he said, I find it implausible, ridiculous almost, that the laws of the universe, or the fine-tuning in this universe, is just there for no reason. It's purposeless. He said, that's not a very healthy and fruitful way of looking into the universe, looking at the universe. And I agree with him. Because our very existence, human beings, our very life, for it to be possible in this universe, is based on a knife edge, on a mass conspiracy of intricate fine-tuning. And I'm not talking about the development of species, so it transcends evolution. I'm talking about the very universe to exist in the state that it does to permit your existence on this beautiful blue and green ball going around the sun. Our very existence, your very existence, is based on a knife edge, on this fine-tuning, based on various constants like the gravitational constant, Planck's constant. For example, we have physicists, they say, and this is technical, that the phase space, the volume of phase space of possible universes had to be so small, and the number is 1 over 10 to the power of x. What's x? 10 to the power of 123. So think about this number. 1 over 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. There are more zeros in this number than there are atoms in the universe. And it's equivalent of me being a dartsman. Okay, who likes darts here? No one? Okay, well, in London we like darts, yeah? We play in the pub, you see. I'm only kidding. Yeah? Say I'm a dartsman. And I had to hit the center of a proton. Proton, okay? Something within the atom. If the whole universe was my dartboard. That's the conspiracy here. That is the conspiracy. So we question, how did this come to be? Well, the three possibilities is just there. Don't have to question it. Natural law, physical necessity. Number 2, chance. Number 3, design. Let's work our way forward. The first point, is it physical necessity just there? Well, if it was just physical necessity, people, if it was just physical necessity, that would mean that we shouldn't question in the first place. There shouldn't be anything that we should question in the first place. It also implies that the universe, another universe could exist that would permit our existence. And that's not true, because there could be other universes that wouldn't permit our existence, according to physicists. So there's nothing physically necessary about these constants and this fine-tuning. And this is why Professor Paul Davies, he advocates this point, saying there's nothing necessary about this fine-tuning for us not to be able to question it. So the first option is implausible. What the second? The chance. And this is what I call the atheist mantra. But there's a chance. Even though it's so small, still a chance. Well, first and foremost, the chances are so improbable that to even advocate something like this, we can't have a conversation anymore. Because it's equivalent of saying, if there's a pink elephant that appears on my driveway, a pink elephant that appears on my driveway overnight, then I don't have to question it. It's possible that it happened by chance. That's tantamount to that kind of discourse. It's counter-discourse, counter-discussion. Also, you could claim anything. I could claim, my mother's not my mother anymore. She is a green crocodile that was born on Mars and flew here on a rickshaw. Mr. Atheist may say to me, Mr. Tzortzis, you're crazy. And I reply, but there's a chance. There's no discourse anymore, because we don't even use this in our practical day-to-day life. And I would argue it's not just about chance. It's about something called specified probability, which basically means what? It's a probability and it conforms to an independent pattern. Let me use a gorilla as an example, a monkey. We have a monkey on a laptop, typewriter, iPad, iPhone, use your imagination, and it's typing away, okay, for 24 hours. Then you come into this room with your Starbucks, or for the leftists amongst you, the Cafe Nero coffee, yeah? And you basically say, and you see him sleeping, or she sleeping, or it sleeping, and you have printed out next to the typewriter or laptop the play of Romeo and Juliet. O Romeo, wherefore art thou, O Romeo? Deny thy father, deny thy name. Or to make it more Islamic, O Abdullah, deny thy mother, deny thy tribe, yeah? You empathize with me, yeah? So you have this on a piece of paper. So not only was it was improbable, but it conformed to independent pattern of English grammar and a Shakespearean play. Surely you'd say someone else did this, it wasn't a monkey. Well, then someone could say, well, it still could be chance, because what about the monkey hypothesis? If you put a monkey in a typewriter, then it will, in a relatively short amount of time, it will come up with something. Oh, that's not very true. According to British mathematicians, they took the monkey experiment and they said to just have a few words of Hamlet's play, to be or not to be. How long do you think they calculate it would take for a monkey to do that on a typewriter?
Lifetimes. No longer than the universe existed or something.
Yes. 28 billion years. I've heard things like 3 days, an hour. 28 billion, to be or not to be, people. Now imagine trying to conform to the whole pattern of the entire universe. So to claim the chance hypothesis is almost negating your own existence, because the universe is only 14 billion years old. Do you understand this point? The Qur'an mentions a beautiful rhetorical point here, and the Qur'an basically says, أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ? Do you not use your brain? Honestly. So the chance hypothesis is a non-hypothesis. There is a contention to this argument though. And the contention is the anthropic principle. They're saying, look, since we're alive, we shouldn't be questioning that we're alive because we're alive. That's actually true. Why should you question that you're alive because you're alive? There's nothing to question. I'm alive. However, the anthropic principle is a misapplication. It's a misapplied argument. Because we're not saying we're questioning why we're alive. We're saying that we should question that the reason we're alive is as a result of fine-tuning. Let me give you an example. Say, Omar, he is an undercover spy and he works for ISI in Pakistan. Okay? ISI in Pakistan, one of the most famous investigative kind of CIA type of agencies in Pakistan. Okay, in the world actually now. I think they're like 4th best or something. And the reason they're 4th best was quite interesting. The scandal in Pakistan, what happened, is that, you know, the American embassy, and they got all these like so-called NGOs into the country, but they were all spies. Within a day, 8,000 NGOs were out of the country. So they already knew they were there. Talk about intelligence or what, man? That's amazing, huh? So, the point I'm trying to say is imagine he was a spy, and then he took me, handcuffed me, and took me to Pakistan on trumped up drug charges, okay? This guy takes far too much testosterone or steroids or something, yeah? Whatever, yeah? And you go, and you're in a court, and I have no witnesses, and that's it. They condemn me to the firing squad with 100 marksmen. I'm on the wall, and all of you are marksmen. You've been trained marksmen. You were born with a gun. You have lasers. The bullets are laser guided, if that's possible. Just imagine it's the best gun in the world, 99.99% accuracy, and you're like an inch away from me. And you have lasers on my forehead, and you hear, bang. And I'm not dead. Now, obviously I shouldn't be surprised I'm alive because I'm alive. Obviously. But does that mean I shouldn't be surprised I'm alive because of you guys missed the improbability of you missing? There's a difference in argument. Obviously I shouldn't be surprised I'm alive because I'm alive, but I should be surprised that the reason I'm alive is because you guys somehow missed. And that's why the anthropic argument is a misplaced argument. Do you understand that? Good. So, the best explanations there must be design. Now this is where Richard Dawkins comes along. He runs into the middle of the discourse. And he says in his book, The God Delusion, on page 157, 158. 157, 158. He says, the design argument is quite an intuitive argument. It makes sense, people. The argument makes sense. But there is a problem. There is a problem. Who designed the designer? That's his, in my view, his only argument that undermines theism in my view. Because he even says in these pages, this is my central argument. He says, this is my central argument. And he has a load of premises that don't follow. Obviously his philosophy is bad. He may be a good scientist, but it doesn't mean he's a good philosopher. And he says, evolution makes sense for species. We don't have an explanation for physics yet, like cosmology, but we just have to wait for one. Sounds like blind faith to me, yeah? Anyway, and then he says, who designed the designer? Now, in response to this, if we study the philosophy of science, and I actually met Richard Dawkins in the World Atheist Convention in Ireland in Dublin, and I said to him, you don't want people to read the philosophy of science, because he was asked that question in the conference, and he ignores it. Just do the science, forget the philosophy of science. Do you know why? Because if you study the philosophy of science, you see that it's not biblical truth anymore. It's not gospel truth anymore. It is speculative. It has a scope, it's limited, can't be applied to everything like moral truths, can't be applied to things like political truths, or even morality or feelings. You imagine going to your wife and saying, in a nice Urdu, Janu, yeah, Meri Jaan, my life, my baby. If you say these things, yeah, and you say, I love you. And then she goes, there's nothing but chemicals in your brain, yar. I mean, what kind of life are you going to have with your wife, man? Is just chemicals? Is that it? Yeah. No wonder. That's why if you really reduce the scientism, which is the epistemological view that things can only be proven with science, if you use that, then it logically follows that a bombing in Iraq is not killing of innocents. It's just a rearrangement of molecules. Because fundamentally it would just matter. To put a moral judgment on this from a scientism perspective is just what? It's sentimentalism. You have no scientific basis for it because it's just chemicals. And if it's just matter, then it doesn't really matter, does it? And I challenge anybody, that is the logical conclusion from a very crude scientism perspective. That's another discussion. So where were we? Who designed the designer? So in the philosophy of science, the best explanation doesn't require an explanation. It doesn't require an explanation. I'll give you an example. Say we go to Mars, we're all future astronauts, and we're digging away, and we find the camera, we find an iPhone, an iPad, we find glasses, we find pottery, arrowheads, whatever the case may be. What is the best explanation? That there was a civilization there. Now if Richard Dawkins V comes along and says, you can't claim such a thing, you don't know their names or where they came from, who's got the best explanation? You have. And it doesn't require another explanation because it is the best explanation. Also, if you're saying the best explanation always requires an explanation, then you're stuck. Because if the best explanation requires an explanation, what about the explanation of the best explanation? And what about the explanation of the best explanation of the best explanation? If it's an ad infinitum set of explanations, you never have explanations anymore, and therefore undermines the whole basis of science in the first place. Imagine saying to a scientist, prove to me the external world exists. They can't. It's an axiom. It's axiomatic knowledge. It basically means it's a universal truth that we accept. Because we don't know the external world exists. How do you know your brain is not in Mars, and there's not probes in your brain, and aliens make you think the way you think and make you feel the way you feel? You can't prove that. It's an axiom. It's a fundamental premise we have to build our worldview upon. That the external world is the external world. There's no matrix. Yeah? And imagine saying to a scientist, or anyone who advocates a very crude scientism perspective and saying, well, prove to me the external world exists. You can't. So imagine wanting explanations ad infinitum. You'll never have science in the first place. So therefore, the contention who designed the designer is actually not a valid contention. Because the design hypothesis from the fine-tuning of the universe to permit our very life on this planet is actually the best explanation. And the best explanation doesn't require an explanation. It's like saying, Zen Buddhism. Who reads about Buddhism? Anyone? It's very interesting. I was very interested in Buddhism, especially the Tibetan tradition. And what's the sound of one hand clapping, sir?
One hand can't clap.
No. The sound of one hand clapping is the sound of one hand clapping. Isn't it? Why is the floor the floor? Why is it the floor? Because it's the floor, man. Sometimes we just stop at that. It's the floor. Why is the floor the floor? Because it's the floor, dummy. Yeah? That's what we say. Obviously, practically, one hand can't clap unless you got big fingers or something, yeah? Or it depends how you define clapping. That's a different discussion. But the point is, sometimes the questions themselves are the answers. Why is the ceiling the ceiling? Because it's the ceiling. So the point is, the design hypothesis from the perspective of the fine-tuning of the universe is the best explanation. So we've got two really strong arguments, in my view, for the existence of the divine. The existence of the basic definition of the monotheistic God. He's one, eternal, immaterial, intelligent. Just like the definition as expressed in the Qur'an in the 112th chapter. So where does this leave us? It shows to us that God is not a delusion from this perspective. Because a delusion is something that's a figment of an imagination, like fairy tales or little angels in the bottom of your garden that you can't really prove or justify, or your 4-year-old son's imaginary friend. Or the one that you still have now, yeah? So the point is, it's not like that because we have good reasons now to believe. We've provided not only a premise, but a substructure to our argument. And for someone to break the argument, they have to break the whole argument and reconstruct a positive argument for their position. So I would humbly say, I'm not saying this is 100% absolute truth. I'm not portraying it that way. I'm just saying we have good reasons to believe. It's reasonable. Now, how does this lead to religion in Islam? And this is like the final part of today's presentation, which I think is good to Islamify the lecture. The reason being, because I'm a Muslim, I converted to Islam 9 years ago. I come from a Greek background. I look thoroughly Pakistani, yeah? I was in Pakistan just a few weeks ago, yeah? I was on a tour, went to Faisalabad, Rawalpindi, Lahore, Islamabad. And in Lahore, they've got an amazing saying. The saying is, if you haven't been to Lahore, you haven't been born. Yeah? What an amazing saying, huh? Which is not true, by the way. Because if you're in Lahore, you want to die, man. The driving is atrocious. Every single car looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger took a hammer and started hammering the car for about an hour. Honestly, because the driving is atrocious. There are no rules. It's jungle. All you hear is beep beep. On the motorway, they cross lanes without indicating. Do you know how many prayers we're doing in the car? Yeah, it's phenomenal. The driving in Pakistan, you haven't driven if you haven't driven in Pakistan. That's how mad Pakistan is, yeah? But alhamdulillah, all praise to God, it's a very nice place. The people are very warm, very hospitable. I had a chapli kebab. Chapli kebab is this round, flat kebab, and it's called a slipper kebab. It's very tasty, but it's probably made out of slipper. Because I had food poisoning. I caught food poisoning, yeah, it was really bad. But alhamdulillah, it was only for 6 hours, so I recovered quickly. But the youth are very active there. There's a lot of intelligent people, in the cities especially. But unfortunately, most of Pakistan is 75% rural. It's a rural nation, and it's relatively backward. Now, and its backwardness is not because of its tradition, not because of Islam. Islam will solve the problems of things like the way they treat women, which is it's an atrocity. It's despicable. Like, for example, a man might not like her husband, he might have a judgment about her or suspicion, who cut her nose, put acid on her, cut her ears, and say that she was like a naughty woman, she did something bad. It's really bad, and it's our responsibility as Muslims, and especially people who are Muslim in Pakistan, not to have a brain drain, to go back to our countries as well and to educate the masses, because the government's not going to do it. Jilani, what's his name? Zindani, Zadari, whatever his name is. These guys are corrupt anyway. They're the most baseless human beings ever. I mean, when Pakistan was in floods, they were like in 5-star hotels talking about diplomacy with the counterparts. It's the most unjust nation in the world. We don't advocate it's an Islamic state. Even on my visa, it was my passport, it's in my bag. The Islamic Republic of Pakistan. It's not an Islamic Republic of anything. Honestly, it's an atrocity to even put the name Islam in that country. And as Pakistanis, I consider myself as a newborn Pakistani as well now, because I really love the nation. I look so Paki anyway, yeah? Is it okay to say Paki? It means pure anyway, right? So, and it's a shame, and we need to go to the rural areas and educate these people. Educate them. It's because it's really sad that they have basically moved away from their tradition, which honors women and protects women, to the point where it treats women like slaves and cuts them and burns them just because of suspicion. Just because of suspicion. Wasn't it the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, upon whom be peace, said that in suspicion there is a lie? It's lies, it's fabrication. It's based on evil just to be suspicious of someone. Doesn't the Qur'an say qawwamuna? To take care of women, to protect and honor the women, honor each other. Doesn't the Qur'an say this? Why are we doing it, people? Don't know how I got to this topic. But it actually does relate, because a valid claim from atheists is like, look at you people, it's the Muslim world, you guys are crazy. You guys are crazy. You complain of racism, but we have the biggest racism in our own countries. I guarantee you. Who's Kashmiri here? Who's Punjabi? He will probably never be able to marry Kashmiri. Ever. And they're in the same country and they have the same religion. We're so pugnacious as a community. We're like, oh, EDL, BNP, they're so racist. Islam's all about justice. We don't even fix our own home, people. We don't even fix our own home. That's so sad. Don't you think that's so sad? The reason I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder on this issue, yeah, is because I came from a Greek family that's very loving. My sister's Greek. She's got a long-term partner who's Turkish. My mum's a refugee from the Turkish invasion. And my mum's accepting that. And she's not even Muslim. She doesn't hold our values, but has the values that we should hold. This is why it baffles me that I came into a tradition that is such a beautiful tradition, but it's abstract. We're not internalizing anything. And we have racism in our countries. Pakistani can't marry Bengali. Bengali can't marry an English guy. All the things are changing, but we need to change these. We have racism in our own countries, people, and we complain of racism in this country. It doesn't work that way. Allah doesn't work that way. Ibn Taymiyyah, a very famous classical scholar, he said, Allah, God, will give authority to the just, not to the Muslims. To the people who are just, who have justice. And justice is something that we should have as a community. Doesn't Allah in the Qur'an says, Inna Allah yuhibbul muqsiteen? God loves the just, God loves the equitable. He says this 3 times. Doesn't God say in the Qur'an, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, kunu qawwamina lillahi shuhada'a bil qisti, wa la yajrimannakum shana'anu qawmin ala ta'dilu? Doesn't the Qur'an say, oh you believe, be steadfast witnesses in justice for God? Don't let the hatred of others make you swerve from justice. Be just, as closer to your duty. Didn't the Prophet ﷺ say, اتقوا الظلم فإن الظلم ظلمات يوم القيامة? Be aware of injustice and oppression, for it's going to be darkness on the day of judgment. And we're full of injustice. And the reason I'm saying this is to show us all that the Islamic tradition doesn't call for injustice and doesn't call for oppression, which is something that sometimes the West or the atheist community talk about, and they reference. For example, there's a famous apostate from Islam, Maryam Namazi. She's an activist in her own right, in her own field. And sometimes I empathize with her because her references are not Islam, are the social outputs of Muslim communities. And she sees it as Islam. For example, she says, why do women, when they get raped, they need 4 witnesses? She thinks that is Sharia law. She thinks that's Islamic law. Many people in the West think Islamic law. Fox News, BBC, Sky News think that's Islamic law. Because our societies practice something that's not Islamic. And many of you, I bet many of you didn't even know the justice system of Islam and how it works with regards to rape. You thought it was 4 witnesses, didn't you, some of you? Who thought it was 4 witnesses? You needed 4 witnesses. That's not true, guys. Rape in Islam is considered under the criminal code of hiraba, of fighting against God and His Messenger, rebelling against the land. And the punishment is severe. It could be exiled, or it could be actually crucifixion. And it could be cutting the hand or cutting the foot. Because of raping a woman. And her testimony is enough and DNA is enough. We don't do any injustice to women. Say that they need to bring 4 witnesses to show that she was raped. That's not Islam. And look how severe the punishment is, which is based on the judiciary with values, with higher burdens of proof. But it's a deserved punishment from that perspective. Why? Because we honor the woman. We're not like what Ken Clark, what he said just last year. What did he say about the woman? For rapists, they go 1 year, which means 6 months. What kind of signal does that give to rapists? Anyway, things to talk about. But the point is, Islam is not about injustice and oppression, okay? So, where were we? What a rant, huh? You know, some of these talks are just therapy for me, yeah? So, yeah, sometimes it's like a monologue, I'm just talking to myself. Anyway, so, God's not a delusion. So how do we Islamify it? How do we make it more Islamic? Well, essentially, I would argue that the Quranic discourse is actually a proof for the divine itself. The book, imagine that. That the Qur'an is a proof for the divine and a proof for the Islamic tradition. Let me elaborate. Now the Qur'an is a very intrusive book. It's a very unique book because what it does, it wants to intrude and impose itself on the inner dimensions of man. Such as his aql in Arabic, the intellect, and the nafsiyah, the internal disposition of the human being. Now this imposition is not a negative one, it's positive because it wants to positively engage. And how does the Qur'an do this? It asks you profound questions. وَفِي أَنفُسِكُمْ أَفَلَا تُبْصِرُونَ. And in themselves, do they not see? أَوَلَمْ يَتَفَكَّرُوا فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ. Do they not reflect within themselves, pertaining to psychological and physiological realities? The microcosm within the macrocosm. The Qur'an asks these questions. Yes, a divine book. وَكَذَلِكَ نُفَصِلُ الْآيَاتِ لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. And thus do we explain our signs and evidences in detail for those who reflect. The word يَتَفَكَّرُونَ comes from the Arabic triliteral stem فَكَرَى, which according to the classical Arabic dictionaries has connotations of the thing that you're reflecting upon. You must inquire about its implications. Don't be a desert romantic. Don't think you're just going to touch the sand, look at the stars and sip on your glass of orange juice. No, not that type of reflection, but the reflection that is deep, that you scratch the surface, you see the implications of the object of reflection and meditation. This is why Professor Malik Badri, who I think is a psychotherapist, a psychologist, and an Islamic scholar, he wrote the book Contemplation, a Psycho-Spiritual Study. And he says contemplation and reflection is a neglected worship in Islam. The Qur'an always says, for those who believe, for those who reflect, for those who know, for those who use their minds, for those who understand, don't you see, can't you see? أَفَلَا يَنْظُرُونَ إِلَى الْإِبِلِ كَيْفَ خُلِقَتْ. Have you not seen the camel and how we created it? Look, reflect, ponder. It's a neglected practice in our tradition. We become, I don't know, is it safe to say the word rabbinical? You know, traditionally the rabbis are very based on law. Cross the T's, dot the I's, that kind of approach. We say in Islam we have a bit more of a balance. We have law, but we have spirit, we have reflection, we look at reality. That's what the Qur'an tells you to do. For those who reflect, for those who think. Now the Qur'an goes even further than this. It actually challenges you with regards to its authorship. Wow, I thought religion was about blind faith. It just says believe and just believe. Just like some interpretations of the Bible in Timothy, it says, this is the inspired word of God. Why? Because it's inspired word of God. Why is it inspired word of God? Because it's inspired word of God. It's a bit of a circular argument, yeah? But the Qur'an says no. Let's give a falsification test. Let's give you a challenge. And it says in the second chapter in the 23rd verse, Surah Baqarah verse 23, وَإِن كُنْتُمْ فِي رَيْبٍ مِّمَّا نَزَلْنَا عَلَىٰ عَبْدِنَا فَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ مِّن مِثْلِهِ وَادْعُوا شُهَدَاءَكُم مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ إِن كُنْتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. And if you are in doubt about this book which we have sent down to our servant, referring to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then bring one chapter like it. Bring a single chapter. Smallest chapter is only 3 lines long. And call on your witnesses, your philosophers, the educated types, whoever, besides God, if you're truthful in your claim. In kuntum sadiqeen. If you're truthful in your claim. Now, according to the classical exegetes, those who explain the Qur'an, they said this has something to do with the uniqueness of the Arabic language in the Qur'an. And I'm going to try and show you an argument that due to the uniqueness of the Arabic in the Qur'an, we have good reasons to believe that it's from the divine, even if you don't even know one letter of the Arabic language. Interesting, huh? Well, let me just write something for you, yeah? I've been holding this pen, I might as well write something with it, right? We have Arabic here, okay? Generally, I'm not talking about aesthetic reception, I'm not talking about like Shakespeare, how nice Shakespeare sounds, or the way it moves you. I'm talking about the structural features of the text. For example, if we look at the English language, we have meters in poetry or prose. For example, we have the iambic pentameter, which Shakespeare used to use. So when people say, well, what about Shakespeare? He's unique, therefore he's divine. No, we're not saying that. We're saying that there's something about the uniqueness that cannot be matched. Shakespeare can be matched. That's why a lot of English scholars, they attribute Christopher Marlowe to his works. So we're talking about the structural features of the Arabic language. And what we have is generally prose and poetry, okay? And prose is split into further 2 subcategories, which is rhyme prose and just straightforward speech. Straightforward speech. Now, poetry is metrical in nature, which basically means it adheres to a rhythmical pattern, and there are 16 of these rhythmical patterns, okay? And they are called, for example, you have one called at-tawil, etc., yeah? And they are called the al-bihar, which comes from the word bahar, which means sea. So it's like the waves of a sea. And their metrical pattern, and this metrical pattern is based upon a syllabic pattern. How do you spell syllabic? Is it 2 L's? Yeah, I rely on Microsoft Word all the time, you know. So syllabic pattern. So at-ta will go something like this. Ba, something like that. So it's a short, long syllable. Okay? So that's the pattern, the internal rhythm of Arabic poetry here. And there's about 16 rhythmical patterns. Straightforward speech is called mursal. And it's a straightforward speech. It's not split with rhyme or rhythm or anything internal. It's just the way I'm speaking today. Hello, how are you? Okay? Nothing special, straightforward speech. Rhyme prose, and let me try and pronounce this properly, is saja. Okay? Now, rhyme prose is defined in the following way. First, it has an accent-based rhythmical pattern. Accent-based. Now, accent-based rhythmical patterns, for example, in the English language would be nursery rhymes. Ba, ba, black sheep, have you any wool? Yes, sir. Get my point? Good. Don't want to deafen you, yeah? So accent-based rhythmical pattern. The second point is it ends with a rhyme. Oh my God, it's like Chinese. Rhyme. By the way, poetry has to end with a rhyme as well. And it has a concentrated use of rhetorical features or rhetorical devices. Now, what are rhetorical devices? Rhetorical devices in balagha, which basically means Arabic rhetoric, is language that intends to please and persuade. Give me examples. An example is iltifat. Iltifat in the Arabic tradition is referencing shifting. And you have this even in classical European literature, which basically means that you shift number, personal pronoun. Let me give an example. In the Qur'an it says, إِنَّ أَعْطَيْنَكَ الْكَوْثَرَ فَصَلِّ لِرَبِّكَ وَانْهَرْ. Indeed, unquestionably, we, the majestic singular for majesty, we have given you the abundance. فَصَلِّ لِرَبِّكَ وَانْهَرْ. Therefore pray to your Lord and sacrifice. Where's the shift? The shift is with the personal pronoun. We to Lord, right? إِنَّ أَعْطَيْنَكَ الْكَوْثَرَ. Verily we have given you the abundance. Therefore pray to your Lord. فَصَلِّ لِرَبِّكَ وَانْهَرْ. Why does that happen? That happens in the Qur'an to enhance the communicative effect. To enhance the effect of the meaning, what's being intended to be portrayed here. In the first verse is about ability. We have given you. So about majesty, power. We can give you. We have given you. The second verse is about what? Intimacy and spirituality. فَصَلِّ لِرَبِّكَ وَانْهَرْ. Therefore pray to your Lord and sacrifice. And the word Rabb has indications, not just Lord, but the one who cares for you, the one who loves you, the one who maintains you. So do you see the shift here? It's based upon the meaning. So this is a rhetorical device, for example, called referencing shifting or iltifat in the Arabic language. Other aspects of rhetorical features include assonance, like sound and rhythm, but that's a technical subject. But the point is, the Qur'an is neither of these. This is why A.J. Arbery, the famous translator and Arabist, translator of the Qur'an, in his introduction, he says the Qur'an is neither prose nor poetry, but a unique fusion of both. Devin J. Stewart. Devin J. Stewart. He is probably the only academic at the moment that I've recently researched that talks about the unique literary form of the Qur'an, the structural features of the Quranic discourse. And he says, it's not sajah, it's not any of the al-bihar, it's not straightforward speech, and he calls it Quranic sajah. He defines it as a different form, because it can't be defined as prose, rhyme prose, can't be straightforward speech, and doesn't conform to any of the rhythmical patterns of poetry. It's unique. It transcends and de-scopes the Arabic language. This is the reality of the Quranic discourse. And the reason it's not rhyme prose and not poetry, they're very technical, but we don't need to get into these. But for instance, the reason it's not rhyme prose because it transcends the use of rhetorical devices, has far more rhetorical features than any other text known that's rhyme prose. Also, it has a greater tendency to monorhyme, because in sajah you have a tendency to have different types of rhyme. For example, the whole of the Qur'an, 50.8% or more than 50% of the Qur'an ends with one letter. And that's the letter, who could guess? Noon. In the Arabic language. So it de-scopes the Arabic language. Now it doesn't mean because it's inimitable, it can't be matched. Therefore, it's divine. We're not saying that totally. What we're saying is, there's a question here. It de-scopes the Arabic language because any text producer in the Arabic tongue, his text would fall into prose or poetry in any of the subcategories. And there's another subcategory like al-kahin style, the soothsayer style, and other subcategories. But generally, it will be in these categories. But the Qur'an de-scopes any of the natural styles of the text producer. What does this mean? This means, in my opinion, it's a miracle. Because it's an act of impossibility almost. Because you can't explain it naturalistically. Because every time you exhaust all letters and words of the Arabic language, which are finite, 28 letters by the way, finite grammatical rules, you always create something that's prose, rhyme, prose, straightforward speech or poetry. But the Qur'an transcends that, but it's still based on the same tools. So it's an act of impossibility, it's a miracle from that perspective. This is why Professor Bruce Lawrence, in his book, The Qur'an, a Biography, on page number 8, he says, as tangible signs, Quranic verses are expressive of an inexhaustible truth. They signify meaning, laid within meaning, light upon light, miracle after miracle. Professor Martin Zammit, Dr. Martin Zammit, a Dutch scholar, he says the Qur'an is the most eminent written manifestation of the Arabic language. But you may not be convinced. You may want to do your research. That's fine. But let me give you the final argument, which I think is the straw that broke the camel's back. Even if you don't know nothing about the technical aspect of the unique structural features of the Arabic language, let's talk about something called logical deduction. What is logical deduction? Logical deduction is taking a universally accepted statement and from that drawing logical conclusions. Now, the universally accepted statement with regards to the Qur'an is that no one has been able to imitate the Quranic discourse. For example, if we look into Arbuthnot, Fitzgerald Arbuthnot, he was a famous British translator and an Orientalist. He said, although several attempts have been made to challenge the Qur'an, none have yet succeeded. None. There is almost a consensus amongst academia, Western, Eastern, Muslim and non-Muslim, that no one has produced anything like the unique structural features of the Arabic language in the Qur'an. So the people best placed to make that judgment conclude that it hasn't been challenged. That's the universally accepted statement. And from that we could draw logical conclusions. But before we do that, I want to ask you a question. Who believes Greece exists? Put your hand up. You all believe Greece exists. Would you bet your life on it? Okay, would you bet £1 million that Greece exists? Put your hand up. We all would, right? Some of us would bet our life and our truth on it. Yes, Greece exists. If you haven't been there, prove it to me. Challenge. Prove to me Greece exists if you haven't been there. Sorry?
You come from Greece?
Oh, okay. So if I said to you I'm a terrorist, would you believe me? If I said to you I'm Nigerian, would you believe me? Why not?
Because don't look Nigeria.
Exactly. If I said to you I'm from the planet Fufula and I'm a Fufulonian, would you believe me? I've just made a claim. I said I'm from Greece. I don't even look Greek, I'm Pakistani, right? I look like a Pakistani. So you haven't proven anything to me. That's not proof, just because I said it. I could claim, I could say I'm God. Yeah, I could say that. Would you believe me? Why?
God is not human.
Well done. MashaAllah. So, prove it to me, guys. You're supposed to be intelligent, you're in university.
It's on a map.
It's on a map. Okay, cool. Here's the world. Here's America. Here's whatever the case may be. Here, Britain. There's Scotland there somewhere. Greece. Yep. Okay, and right there's a diamond. Didn't you see it on the map before? It's a new map. 2012 version. And basically, that diamond is an island. And it's called Candigong. Okay? Candigong. And there's Candigonians. Did you know that? Now you may say, can you pass me that map? Can you pass that map forward? You may say, but there's so many of these printed. So many of them. It must be true. But is that proof?
I've been to Greece.
Yeah, of course you have. I know you have, because you told me. But the point is, I said in the beginning, if you haven't been to Greece, can you prove it? Because our belief is not based upon the fact that we've gone to Greece. And it's not even based upon the fact that we can go to Greece. Our very belief that Greece exists is based on something else. I want to know what it is. You're not telling me. From where? Media. Well, I must be a terrorist then. School. So if school teaches you, say school taught you in the 1950s that the universe had no beginning, no end, it was steady state theory, which is an outdated theory now. Does that mean it's true? Just because all the schools said so? What if you were in 1940s Germany and they said all Jewish people are evil? Would you believe it? That's not an argument. What if you were born in the 1800s and you thought that the black people were inferior? Because they are. It's not an argument.
The thing is that whatever you're taught, you have to kind of use your mind, you have to think.
Yeah, obviously. Well, you're not doing a very good job of it, you guys. No offense. So why does Greece exist? You said you bet your life on it, you give £1 million that Greece exists. Go on, sir.
There's a general consensus that it exists and there is not enough opposing that opinion, therefore it cannot be logically proven.
Very close. I like it. I like it. It's very good. MashaAllah. What's your name? Nadir. It's very good, bro. Basically, some of the stuff that we believe to be true is based on a concept called testimony or recurrent reporting. For example, the professor of philosophy, C.A. Cody, in his book Testimony, he says many things that we believe in, even the world being round, is based on testimony. Because we don't experience the roundness, we don't have a big hand to do this, yeah? Or, we don't go to Australia, have a headache, or we're not on the highest point in the mountain to see the curvature of the earth. We don't know the mathematics, we just believe the pictures. Isn't it? It's testimony. But it's not any old testimony, it's recurrent reporting, which in the Islamic philosophical tradition is called mutawatir. Recurrent reporting is that so many people have testified to this fact from different times and places who have never met. To claim that they are lying is to claim a mass conspiracy. Is to make the most irrational claim that Greece doesn't exist. Because these people have never met. And they come from different times and places. But they all testify to the fact that there's a people called the Greek people. And there's Greeks living there. And there's a place called Greece. And these are the boundaries. These people have never met. And it's not just 5, 6 people. It's thousands of millions over history that have never met. To claim that they're lying is to claim a mass conspiracy. So we believe in it because of testimony. This is the reality. Why am I going through this discussion? Because I'm going to argue to reject the Qur'an as being divine is the equivalent of rejecting that the world is round or that Greece exists. Because when we look at the recurrent reporting, the testimony of the Qur'an, the testimony, which is that no one has been able to challenge the Quranic discourse with regards to its unique structural features, then what are the logical conclusions? Let's work these together. Number one, could come from an Arab. Well, it couldn't have come from an Arab because Arabs challenged the Qur'an and they failed. For example, historically we know that the most famous poet and linguist of the time, called Walid ibn al-Mughira, he said, by God, this can't come from a human being, I'm the best at prose and poetry. We even had people like Musaylima and many others who challenged the Qur'an, tried to challenge the Qur'an and failed from a linguistic and literary perspective. Now someone would say, well, maybe it's not those Arabs, although they were the best placed to challenge the Qur'an, because even according to Western historians and Orientalists, they were Arabic linguists par excellence. They were the source of the Arabic grammar. They purified the Arabic tongue. Someone may say, well, maybe it's the modern Arab. Well, that's impossible. Because at that time it was a homogeneous society, and in homogeneous societies you don't have much linguistic borrowing. Although it's a natural phenomena, according to the linguist Yule, that you do have linguistic borrowing, but when it's a homogeneous society, it maintains relatively pure. But we live in such a heterogeneous society, especially in the Arab world, Africans, even Chinese, Asians, everyone's been mixing, so we've had linguistic degeneration. For example, in many countries in the Arab world, how do you say chocolate? How do you say chocolate in Iraq? No, you don't. Do you know how you say it? Nestle. From Nestle. Because Nestle came, probably before TV came, again, globalization, consumerism, and they said, look, Nestle. That's what chocolate is for them. They don't have a word for chocolate, right? Or how do you say telephone in some countries? I know it's hatif, but some people say telephone or television, yeah? So there's a linguistic degeneration. So how could they even possibly rationally challenge the Qur'an? So it can't be an Arab. Can it be a non-Arab? Well, that's impossible. How can it be a non-Arab? Because you have to know Arabic to challenge the Qur'an. What about the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, sallallahu alayhi wasallam? Can it be the Prophet Muhammad? Well, we say no. Because he was an Arab too. Therefore, logically speaking, he should be able to challenge the Qur'an. Number two, he never had a cultivation of poetry. He wasn't in the fairs where they used to challenge each other in prose and poetry. He didn't have any of the sciences of Arabic balagha, rhetoric, and the nuances of Arabic poetry. Who's seen the film The Message? Although it's just a film, but you know Hind, the Greek actress who plays Hind? She makes an amazing point. It's very deep, and it concludes why it can't be the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace. Because she says, how can a literate man come from a mountain and start blazing with poetry? Do you remember that part? It's always in my head, because that's an amazing, succinct point that says, it's impossible, he was illiterate, ummi, unlettered, couldn't read, didn't engage in those arts and sciences, and yet came up with this new structure. Impossible. This is why Karen Armstrong, the popular historian, she says, if it wasn't because of the unique literary form of the Qur'an, Islam wouldn't have taken root. That's what she says. She makes a profound point here. Also, we know it can't come from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's because his narrations, his traditions that are attributed to him are in a distinct style from the Quranic discourse. So how can anyone from a psycholinguistic perspective maintain two distinct styles over a 23-year period without even mixing them? This is almost a psycholinguistic impossibility, and I studied psychology at university in London, and we did a bit of psycholinguistics, and it's almost an impossibility. Also, we know that any human expression can be emulated if you have the blueprint. Take art, for example. If you have Impressionism or Post-Impressionism, have the works of Monet, whatever the case may be, if you have the blueprint, the colors, the texture, the brush strokes, the type of brush, you have the tools and the blueprint, then you easily could replicate it, its form. And this is true for many pieces of art, because we have amazing replicas that sell for millions sometimes. And even in English poetry, we have many people who could emulate the style of Shakespeare, because they understand it's based on the iambic pentameter, and they use other rhetorical devices, and there you go, it sounds Shakespearean. Put it in the sand for a while, burn it a bit, there you go, it's an old Shakespeare document. But that's true. If you have the blueprint with the tools, you can emulate it if it's human expression. The Qur'an is alive today, 14 centuries on. We have the blueprint, the words, the letters, the tools, the Arabic language, but we can't emulate its expression. This is impossible. It's the only human expression you can't do that with. So it's something to think about. And there are other reasons why it can't come from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but time doesn't permit. So what's the next option? Can't be an Arab, can't be a non-Arab, can't be the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then who's next? God. Because we've shown that there's good reasons to believe in God, right? But it's a bit too soon. At Tzortzis University in London, someone stood up, he was a Christian missionary, and he said, Mr. Tzortzis, but it could be from the devil. I said, okay. I said, how do you know the devil exists? And he thought for a while, and he said, because your Qur'an says so. I said, so you believe in Qur'an, do you? Circular argument. I said, give you another chance. So, well, the Bible says so. But because this is a source that can't be, is part of the unseen, you have to prove that it's a valid source. And you only have the Bible to do that. So you have to prove the Bible to me now. Do you see? So the point is, the best explanation came from the divine. Just using rational deduction. Can't be an Arab, can't be a non-Arab, can't be the Prophet ﷺ, can't be the devil. Therefore, the best explanation, it came from the divine. And you didn't have to know any letter of the Arabic language, just based on testimony. So to reject the Qur'an today will be equivalent of rejecting that China exists, Greece exists, or the world is round. Obviously, with regards to the whole God delusion topic, we have many other questions like the problem of evil. Why is there too much evil in the world? We have the problem of, can you be good without God? Does morality make sense? We could have this discussion, but I think we should have it in the Q&A. But I just want to end. Omar, how long do we have?
As much time as you want.
Yeah? Okay, can we do it into tomorrow evening? Okay, just ending in the last 5 minutes, let's talk about morality. What's interesting from these atheist commentators when they pass judgments on religion like Islam is barbaric, it's backward, you treat your women wrong, you guys are crazy, whatever the case may be, all of these judgments are without foundation. Without foundation. It's a value moral judgment. Why am I saying this? Because you can never have objective morality if you don't have the divine. There is no objective moral truths and moral value if you don't have the divine. Why am I saying this? In absence of the divine, there are only two possible foundations to ground morality. The first one is social consensus, society, and the second is biology. There's only two. If you do social consensus, it's not objective anymore. Because if we're in Nazi Germany, then it would be okay to kill Jews, right? But we know that's wrong. If we're in the 1800s in America, it's okay to enslave the black people. We know that's wrong. We can't ground our morality on social consensus. And it changes all the time. So it makes it relative and subjective. What about the next topic? What about biology? Can we have objective morality from biology? Of course you can't. Evolution, for instance, what does it say? We're just byproducts. Byproducts. Cosmic orphan. Biological miscarriage of nature. You're a byproduct of a lengthy evolutionary process. Your morals have evolved like your unwanted hair and your teeth. This is why the professor of science, philosopher of science, Michael Rules from Guelph University, he states, when you say, love thy neighbor as thyself, you think you're referring above and beyond yourself? It has no true meaning. All our moral judgments and values are just based upon survival and reproduction. So this is the point here. Can we have objective morality? No, we can't. In absence of the divine, our moral judgments and claims are relative and subjective. If we use society and biology as a basis for our moral claims. Now Sam Harris, recently, he wrote the book, The Moral Landscape, trying to say that, look, using scientism or science, we can develop a moral theory. But he even refutes himself in his own book. Because what he does, he talks about the moral landscape. And he says morality is based upon well-being. Okay? So he conflates well-being with moral truths. Okay, so let's analyze this, okay? And this is where I think it's useful to have some basic critical knowledge of philosophy. So, well-being, that's morality, okay? And he says in the moral landscape we have peaks and troughs, okay? These are the peaks and troughs of the moral landscape. And the peaks are well-being. And the troughs are not having any well-being, okay? How can we deal with this thesis? It's very simple. If you could show that on these peaks of well-being, if someone is immoral, then the whole philosophy breaks. And we can show that. Pedophiles can have well-being because of their actions. Someone who's a thief can have well-being because of his action. And he even mentions in his own book saying, yes, there could be immoral people on the peaks of the moral landscape. So it's baseless. It's baseless. You can't have scientism or science defining morality. It's not the scope of science in the first place. And this is why people trying to do that, it's irrational. It's not understanding the philosophy of science in the first place. You can't apply it to moral truths. And this is why his moral landscape fails. Because on the peaks of well-being, you could have pedophiles, rapists, thieves, and they could have a sense of well-being. So, my question is, how dare Richard Dawkins, how dare Sam Harris, how dare Christopher Hitchens, how dare any of these people pass moral judgments as if they're objective, when without the divine, It's just relative and subjective. So in absence of the divine, there's no objective moral truths. And I think deep down inside of us, we know that killing an innocent 4-year-old is objectively morally wrong. If we start with that axiom, then it necessitates God's existence. Because if you have objective morality, it necessitates the existence of God. Because God is the only conceptual anchor that transcends human subjectivity. Now, a contention to this argument is Plato's dilemma, Euthyphro's dilemma. Who knows what that dilemma is? Okay. Euthyphro's dilemma is basically the following. Is it good because what God says is good? Or is it good because God said it? Think about that. Is it good because God commands it? Or is it good because what God commands is good? If you take any of the horns of this dilemma, morality becomes arbitrary. Because if it's good because God said it, then it's arbitrary. Because then God could say you must kill everyone over the age of 55. And if it's good because what God says is good, then how do you know it's good in the first place? So how do you break the dilemma? Well, we say it's a false dilemma. There is a middle path. And that path is, it's because God is good. And His commands come from His nature. This is why the Qur'an says God doesn't command evil things. But you may argue then, well, how do you know God is good? Because you have to know what good is in the first place. Well, it's very simple. God, as a concept, is definitive of what good is. If you think about God, it's the most holy being, right? It's the most pure good being. He defines what good is in the first place. And this is the only best explanation for our sense of objective morality in the first place. So, to end, we've had an interesting discussion, a lot of philosophy, a lot of thought, thick with argument. I hope it's raised a lot of questions. But I want to finally just say to you, let's talk about what it really means without religion, without Islam, without the divine. It means there's no ultimate meaning. Who cares if you spend your life being a biomedical student, and I know you want to be a dentist later, and you want to solve the problem of what? Gingivitis, what do you call that stuff? Disease? Mouth cancer or something, whatever, yeah? Or you're a politician, you want to fight for world peace. Does it matter? There's no true meaning or value anymore. Does it matter if I live my life as an angel and you live your life as devils, if we're going to just end in the grave? If our ends are just the grave, so what, people? So what? There's no ultimate value to your existence. Does it even matter that the universe was here in the first place? The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, he raised an amazing point. He said, I wish the universe never existed. And he said that it's just mindless. Because it has no ultimate basis if we're just a cosmic orphan. That's the reality. Where is the ultimate value? We're like on a sinking ship, people. The universe is going to suffer heat death. It's going to destroy itself. We're on a sinking ship, the Titanic. Does it really matter if you're going to reshuffle the deck chairs or give a glass of milk to the old lady? Who cares? This is why the communist torturers, when they used to torture the Christians, they used to say, and if you see this in the testimonies and the biographies of the Christian prisoners who were freed or escaped, the communists would say, there's no day of judgment. There's no moral motivation. I'm getting away with this. I could pluck your eyebrows. That's not painful, is it? I could pluck your nails, because they used to pluck their nails out, right? With pliers. I could feed you salt all the time and then make you drink your own urine. I could inject you with the AIDS virus, as some people do in Uzbekistan. If you go to Amnesty International, the Uzbek government is complicit with torture. They bowl the political opponents to death. Well documented, and by the way, in cahoots with the West, gets a lot of funding from America. But that's another political issue. But the point is, these things happen. They don't believe in a day of judgment. There's no moral motivation. Don't get me wrong, it doesn't mean atheist people are not good people. Of course they are. Some of them are much better people than religious people. That's not the point. The point is, conceptually, if you really think about it, there's no ultimate meaning or value. And there's no ultimate purpose. Although we attribute purpose to things like inanimate things like a chair to sit on, we don't have any purpose for ourselves. From a scientism perspective, the best you could come up with is our purpose is to propagate our DNA. So why would Richard Dawkins and all the neo-atheists complain about polygamy? 'Cause that's propagating your DNA, right? That's an Islamic thing. The irony, right? The irony. I know that doesn't go too over sisters, yeah? It was like this all of a sudden. Yeah. But the point I'm trying to say is, it's just to propagate your DNA. Now someone would say, well, I could create meaning for my life and purpose for my own life. I want to be an engineer, a doctor, I want to save the world. Well, that's fine, but to me that's a self-delusion. You're making purpose for your life, but for the underlying meaning of your existence, there is no meaning or ultimate purpose. Isn't that just like saying, let's pretend to have purpose? Something to think about. So let's summarize. First and foremost, we said we've got good cogent arguments for the existence of God. We talked about the beginning of the universe. We talked about the fine-tuning of the universe to permit our existence. We also talked a bit about justice and the state of our Muslim community. We also talked about, for instance, the miracle of the Qur'an, the divine nature of the Qur'an. It's an intrusive text. It has a good cogent argument for its claim that it's from the divine. We spoke about objective morality, and it necessitates the existence of God as it's the only conceptual anchor that transcends human subjectivity. And also we spoke about a little bit about existential themes. We did this in the beginning as well. Who are you? Why are you? Whose are you? When we answer these questions, then we'll be able to understand a more true understanding of who we are. This way it all relates to the concept of who we are. As a philosopher once said, that all knowledge is self-knowledge at the end of the day. So hopefully this teaches you more about yourself. Maybe you disagree or agree, but let's have a very frank Q&A and discussion if anyone wants to raise any questions. If I've said anything offensive, I apologize. I don't mean it that way. It's just my expressive Greek nature, yeah? You know, just imagine me on the Athenian court in ancient Greece, it's like debating and stuff, yeah? That's just my nature, yeah? So if anything has come across a bit harsh or offensive, it wasn't intended that way. I really want to have a engagement with you guys. Let me end with how we end our gatherings in Islam. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت وأستغفرك وأتوب إليك. Thank you very much for your patience, and I'm looking forward to questions and answers. You could give this back to the sister.
Here's already one question.
Oh, that's a huge question.
Yeah, very quickly, if you can. Very quickly, if you've got any questions, you can just pass them down to the front on a piece of paper, or you can simply put up your hand. Just one or two quick announcements. How to solve the Israel-Palestine conflict. Norman Finkelstein will be doing a talk on Wednesday the 8th at the University of Glasgow. Leaflets on the front for any details. Also, we're showing the message tomorrow, like Brother Hamza mentioned.
Oh yeah.
We're showing it in Cali Uni, room M323. At what time? 5 o'clock? 5 o'clock. Okay, any questions at all?
Brother Nadir. Assalamu alaikum, brother. It's alright, it's what he says that matters, not who he is, right?
But yeah, right. So my question is regarding the fact of the oscillating universe theory.
Sure.
Now, modern scientists are starting to move away from this idea of a Planck's wall where we cannot penetrate back in time and, time has a beginning. So obviously we have this expanding contracting universe now. My question is, does this not actually fall in line with the concept of Islam? For example, Allah has 99 attributes and we consider these infinite. Many people consider Allah to be infinitely merciful.
Yes.
Therefore, in order to be infinitely merciful, you would argue that perhaps you would have to create infinitely. Now, if you used to create infinitely, then why does this not perhaps prove that an oscillating universe is indeed a possibility or even true?
We can, yeah.
Do you, is this something you agree with?
Not necessarily. I think the oscillating universe fails on 2 points. First point is, when a universe emerges, it means that there is a beginning to a particular universe. Yeah? So it still necessitates that the universe began. If it began, then it was caused. Yeah? Okay? The second point is you have the problem of the infinite regress. And the third point you have is the problem of entropy. You have a problem of entropy. And therefore, the cosmologists say because of entropy, it necessitates a beginning. However, when we say God is infinite, we're saying He's an undifferentiated infinite. Because when we say the infinity doesn't exist in the real world, we're saying conceptually as an infinite with discrete parts. That's the problem. It doesn't negate the infinite of God. And this is why the question here, the brother saying was special pleading, had a lot of logical fallacies. But actually, I think his question was a logical fallacy. It's a shame that he's not here. We could have this discussion. Because he says that I'm specially pleading to things like all power and infinite and a personal God, when we can't even prove it. But if he was attentive to the argument, what we're saying is that the infinity that we're talking about is a differentiated infinite, not an undifferentiated infinite, okay? Also, some theologians will say, well, God is not infinitely merciful, because what does that mean? He just says He's the merciful. So any conception of mercy, He's greater than that. It doesn't mean He's necessarily infinitely merciful, because that's not generally the theological position that some of the scholars take. Some of the scholars take the position that He is the merciful, the loving, al-wudud, the excessively loving, but all of His names and attributes are in interplay with each other. So when He says, for example, He's the just, and He creates our actions, He's the creator, then there's a reconciliation happening here. They don't say He's the just, but He creates our actions, because there's a contradiction in a way. Because if He created action, then He's unjust because we don't do our own actions. Do you see? So the whole free will philosophy. So generally, in an aspect of theology, they say it's not infinitely merciful per se, because how can you conceptualize that? They say He's the merciful. Ar-Rahman, with a definite article, al, yeah? So there's that view. Your view is interesting, but I don't see how it's conclusive, yeah? But it doesn't mean it's wrong. I'm not saying it's wrong. Is that okay, bro? JazakAllah. There's a sister at the back.
Is it too broad a question to ask why you think atheism is on the rise? It's so widespread, especially amongst students.
Yeah, because it's a fashion, isn't it? It's like smoking pot. Honestly, in Pakistan, it's just like that. In Lahore, go to Lahore, right? Did I say in Lahore they have a saying, if you haven't been to Lahore, you haven't been born. Yeah, I've said that, yeah? Which is not true, yeah? But the point is, in Lahore, yeah, the university like LUMS, the Lahore University of Management Sciences, it's like the Oxford of Pakistan. They're like atheist and secular because it's trendy. You know, we're backward mullahs, they talk about crazy things, earthquakes, volcanoes, forget them, yeah? And the media, they have an amazing way of creating this really ridiculous antithesis. You have the academics versus the mullahs. Yeah, and then they have a challenge, the mullahs fail, academics win, secularism is right, atheism is true. Yeah? That's the logical kind of fallacy, because they say, oh, these guys must know it, therefore let's be an atheist too. And you'd be surprised, even people in this country, they say they're an atheist and they never even thought about their own perspective. And for me, I just think, how can a human being do that? At least be agnostic. At least say, well, I don't know. Yeah? But to even make an assertion, there is no God. That's atheism. Saying, haven't seen the evidence, I don't think there's conclusive evidence, that's an agnostic. How can you say, how is atheism? There is no divine. To even claim that, on what basis? Stay an agnostic. Let's have a conversation. Why put your flagpole down so quickly when you don't even know? You haven't even addressed these arguments, you haven't had a discussion. So I think a lot of it is a social thing, and because Islam generally is represented in Pakistan by the wrong people. It's the wrong people, it's a social thing. And what's interesting, we went to the challenges in our tour in Pakistan a few weeks ago. There's a professor called Professor Pervez Hoodboy. He's internationally acclaimed, Hood boy or something, yeah? But he became a rude boy, I'm going to tell you why, yeah? What happened was, I was trying to say, let's have a discussion, a dialogue, a debate on these issues. He wrote a book on reason and revelation, and he ripped through the arguments of some of Muslim apologists concerning the divine nature of the Qur'an, that they're trying to find the speed of light in the Qur'an, and ridiculous. And a lot of things that he wrote, I actually agree with. You can't say that the Qur'an predates science. The best position we could take is that the Qur'an doesn't go against established reality, established fact. So there's all these things that I agreed with him. I gave my hand open to him because we drove all the way from Islamabad to Lahore, 5-6 hours, just to have the debate with him, because he agreed last minute. I was giving a lecture in UCI in Islamabad, and we drove all the way to Lahore. I was reading his book on PDF. I went there, wanted to engage with him because he's well known for being his anti-Islamic and anti-kind of theistic perspective, his anti-Sharia, anti-Islam, anti-Muslim culture, and he's very popular amongst the academics. I was at the Rifa School of Medicine and Shifa School of Medicine, the best medical colleges in Pakistan, And even the professors were complaining about him. And no one was challenging him because all the media do, they put a mullah with him. Like crazy mullah, yeah, if you like. So let's try and someone who sounds at least educated, yeah? Doesn't claim to be, but it sounds, yeah? Let's have a discussion. So I had a discussion. Do we have good reasons to believe we can everything what I told you today, I gave in that presentation. And I even agreed with him on many points and whatever the case may be. Anyway, so when we had this discussion, he was treating me like as if I was not even a guest. He was treating me as if that everything I said was stupid and dumb. He didn't even address it. I asked him many times to. And to cut a long story short, he walked out of the room and told me to shut up. He went, shut up, you liar, yeah? Professor and his co-professor walked out as well and he went, shame on me. Shame on me as I'm trying to talk to you here. And that's the reality in Pakistan. Now this doesn't mean anything bad about Professor Hoodboy. The reason he walked out was because he was scared. If he's exposed as an atheist or someone who deliberately wants to challenge Islam in a negative way without having a positive dialogue, he could be killed. And that's the problem. We've created such environments. So the good thing came out that he was exposed because he didn't want to have a dialogue and discussion and debate and be rational. He wanted to keep this kind of dichotomy, the mullahs versus the academics. But on the other hand, he had to walk out because it was filmed. And if he's shown to be someone like that, he can be killed. Which is a shame because in medieval Baghdad, we had atheists, Christians, Muslims, non-Muslims having intellectual discussion. We're not anti-discussion. We're just anti-being rude. Because what's the point of discussion? There's a point to it. It's not for the sake of just discussing. The point is to communicate. Now, for example, if I want to portray something to you, for example, if you're President Bush, and part of my freedom of speech is to basically account you, because the objectives of freedom of speech, if you read the Enlightenment philosophers like Thomas Paine, John Stuart Mill, they said the objectives of freedom of speech was truth, progress, and accountability. So that's the objectives of freedom of speech. It's not an end in itself. It has an objective. Why talk for no reason, in a way? Blah, 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 blah. Yeah, what's the point? So if I want to account Bush or Obama for having an unjust war in North Pakistan with their drone attacks, right? If I started by saying, you black slave, you smelly dog, your mum is so fat. I'm free to say those things, right? Am I free to say that? Yes. Did I reach the objective of freedom of speech? Exactly. We're not against freedom of speech, people. We're against using freedom of speech to restrict your freedom of thought. And that's what happens, especially neoliberals. You're anti-freedom of speech. I could say that the Prophet was a pedophile, or I could say that he was a murdering beep, beep, beep. But the point is that civilization? Is that how you want to talk to people? Is that how you want to engage with another culture like that? You're not fulfilling any of the objectives of freedom of speech. You're actually self-defeating. And this is why I think the Islamic tradition on expression is quite balanced. We don't have this ridiculous, look at the comedians, some of these comedians, what they got away with. Even the British public agree with the Islamic stance, by the way. Speak to any normal British guy and they say, yeah, be nice. Talk, engage, be sensitive, have dialogue. Not just because of this some kind of, you think you have this intrinsic freedom, you could just offend everybody and not really have progression, cultural progression. Look what happened with, what's his name, who pronounces R's as W's? Ross, yeah? Jonathan Ross. Remember what he said where they called this old man and they said about his daughter or something? It was very vile. There was an outrage from the public. Rightly so. How dare you use freedom of speech just to think that you're some kind of special comedian? And you know what the irony is? There's no such thing as absolute freedom of speech. Go to any secular country in the world, you have a whole list. Libel laws, hate speech laws, product defamation laws. You have, the list goes on and on. So let's be nuanced in our discussion. What was the question? What was the question?
Why is atheism so popular?
Oh yes, so atheism popular is because from a social reason, one, because atheism or secularism is usually associated with traditions that are progressive, that have relatively more justice and peace and economic prosperity. And that's a shame. A lot of people were sheep. We're not the shepherds, we're sheep. We're feathers in the wind. We're not the winds of change. We should be the winds of change. Don't just go where civilization takes us. Then we should scrutinize and think, Well, really, what was the basis for the secular tolerance and tradition? It was actually the Islamic tradition. Do you know that? The treatise on tolerance by John Stuart Mill and John Locke and others, their inspiration came directly from scholars who were inspired by Islamic Spain and the Islamic tradition. Because of the convivencia in Islamic Spain, where Jews, Christians, and Muslims were together, had libraries. Even one of the kings would have a library for like 150,000 books when the leaders of Northern Europe couldn't even write their names. We had the products such as Ibn Sina, who wrote the book, The Canon of Medicine, that was used for 600 years in Europe. The Islamic tradition was the basis of the 12th century Renaissance. Do you know this? Oxford University, the best university in the world almost, was a product of Islamic thinking. Go to Wikipedia, type in Oxford University, and see that the founders of Oxford University, do you know what they did? The teachers or the founders of Oxford University traveled to Islamic Spain and took the Islamic manuscripts and said, oh my God, these guys have cosmology, they talk about physics, science, astronomy. And then they went and developed the school which is now known as Oxford University. Imagine that. Oxford University because of Islam. The theory of innocent until proven guilty came from where? Muslims. It was the Sharia law. Sharia law is the basis for Western civilization. I challenge anybody, I have the reference. But I don't remember it, that's the problem. I think it was a Swedish king, he traveled to the Muslim world and he saw some of the kind of practices in the courts of the Qadi, the Islamic judge, and he took it back, and then that's the principle of innocent until proven guilty was developed in Europe from that perspective, directly. There was a directly, I'll send you the reference, I'll put my email down. Also, for example, what about justice? If you look at Amnon Cohen, a Jewish historian, he wrote a book, A World Within, 2 volumes. And he collected 1,000 records, Sidur records of the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim Empire. And he found that although the Jews had freedom to go to the rabbinical courts, even the Christian courts, in the majority of the cases they went to the Qadi, the Islamic judge. The historian Richard W. Bullier, in his book, The Case for the Islamo-Christian Civilization, he says that there was impartial justice implemented in the Muslim world when the values were implemented, not the dictators and despots that we see today. Also, you have, for instance, rabbis. If you read the book by Philip Manso called Constantinople, there he references a primary source, a letter, a rabbi in 1453, writing a letter to his persecuted brethren in Europe, saying, come to the land of the Turks, rich are the fruits of the earth, etc., etc., we live in peace. And there's so many, like David de Bertonoro, David de Rossi, Einhard Gratz, a 19th century Jewish historian, Maria Rosa Menokol, a historian specializing in Islamic Spain, talks about exactly the same things. That if she said, for instance, if we talked about the debt that we have to the Muslim Arab civilization, you wouldn't believe it. So there are all these links. Anyway, the point is, even if atheism is a trend because secularism, atheism is so nice, look what it's doing today. It's all this goodness is actually as a result of the Arab Muslim Islamic civilization in the first place. And from that thinking, if you're born at that time, that means you should be Muslim, because they had the best civilization of the time. So that's not a very cogent argument of why you are who you are. So we should always criticize and think and transcend these social norms, so we could not just be a feather in the wind, but the winds of change, which is very important. Yeah, I've dragged on for far too long. It's getting dark, everyone's hungry and tired and thirsty. I'm going to write down my website for continuing discussions, and then we'll leave it as that. So my email is, info@hamzatzortzis.com. And on this website, by the way, there's articles that detail the arguments I've been speaking about today. There's an argument called the Quranic argument for God's existence. There's an essay called The Challenge of the Qur'an, the linguistic and literary miracle. There's an argument to the response to the God delusion. There's an article on the response to the problem of evil. It's got a lot of stuff on there. It's almost like a book on a website for free. So check it out. It gives details and references to everything I spoke about today. So I hope you enjoyed the lecture. And may God bless you guys. Assalamu alaikum.